I realized that because I'm actually not going to talk about this. I've been publishing a lot of my stuff here on this doc, Dinis Cruz AI. And since we're in a log company, I've been publishing a lot of these projects and business ideas and all sorts of stuff. So again, if you want to see some good examples of using AI to do really advanced research, take a look here. One of the things I've done recently, and by the way, a lot of these ones are literally conversations I have. And just to give you an idea of these workflows, because I think this will be relevant, is some of these workflows is I have a conversation, I have a meeting, I do a voice memo, and then I use ChatGPT, Deep Research, and Claude to create what are, I would argue, pretty good documents. So these are documents that fundamentally they represent the ideas that I want to cover, but these are really good, highly detailed project plans, concepts, etc. So for example, this is about creating a graph power legal knowledge, right? Which I think the legal guys here should be all over it, right? So but this is a really cool way to present ideas. So these days, that's kind of what I do, right? And also relevant to what I'm going to talk about in a second, I've done quite a lot of thinking about the news industry. And I think there was somebody mentioned the news industry, right? And I published quite a bit of it. So if you guys go here, the future of news, right? And it's funny because I've been talking a lot about how monetizing and how do all this stuff. And the thing I find fascinating is how the news industry, for all its complaints, makes it really hard to give them money, right? Which I found it really weird, right? For an industry that keeps complaining that they keep being commoditized by Google and by all those things. There's very little APIs. There's very little. They're not using literally the technology they even should be using. So what I want to talk about is, and I want to give you some real examples on this, because I think sometimes when we talk about GenAI and the areas that adds value, right? Sometimes you can't visualize it. So I really want to do that. And I'm going to go a little bit deep on the tech stuff, but hopefully it's kind of pretty visual, right? So yeah, I've been doing sort of security for a long time. I'm open source. I do a lot of community stuff. I work for a startup. I started this company called Cyber Boardroom. I'm actually into 2 other companies now based on the same technology. So almost like I bring the tech and I'm part of the technology element. So yeah, so I kind of gone into, again, retail, one of the ones not in the news, hopefully, right? And basically, I thought that I could start with 5 principles that I cover and talk a lot about it, and I'm going to basically just mention them quickly, right? So the first one is these NFRs, which is non-functional requirements, which is basically fundamentally what he was talking about. So this is all the workflows. This is fundamentally, if you can't ship, if you don't have a tech stack that allows you to very effectively release what you're trying to do, you can't move very quickly from, in a way, it's very quickly from moving from the commodity, the custom build to what feels like a product, you have a massive problem, right? I think going to the point of taking a service business and making it to products, I think before the current Gen AI models, doing that would be very expensive, right? And that's the problem, right? You would have to really build a full-blown software development team to build that. I think now there's a great opportunity to do that so much faster. But one of the first things I did when I developed a Cyber Boardroom was I made it run everywhere. And that sounds simple, but it's very hard to do, right? And it's this ability to just have infrastructure that is disposable. And one of the things that he mentioned is also like the LLMs need to be disposable. So you need to think of the LLMs as something that is replaceable. Which also means that the better the LLMs get, the better you get. So again, don't bet against the people that are moving to the right very fast, right? So non-functional requirements is the biggest thing that I think you really need to make sure you invest, right? The other one is ask this really interesting question, which is what can only be done with the LLM, and ask it 5 times. Do the 5 whys of it. And the thing about this is there's a common theme that I have in the stuff I do, which is about provenance, but it's about making it simple. So the idea here, right, in cybersecurity, there's always this cool principle, which is our job in cybersecurity is to make the business simple. It's not to make it more complex, right? So the same thing with the LLMs. The LLM should make your business simple, not more complex. And complex, a black box that you don't understand, that's complexity, right? But there's things in here, right, that you can, like I'm going to show an example, that I'm using LLMs that actually make the process simple. Because without the LLMs, you'll be, and the bit that I'm using, the specific bit that I'm using, everything will be much more complex. And outside of it, everything should be code, because code is the most deterministic way to run things and cost effective and very fast. And like you were saying, you can now build things that in the past you couldn't very fast, right? Again, this is where it's very powerful. Make you and your team more productive. And look at the stuff I've been publishing on my blog for ridiculous examples where literally not being funny, but I have a meeting, I do a voice memo, I create a brief, I send to a customer, and they have a 10-page, fully blown, 20-page, one-page, or whatever, how many documents I need to send him, and I do that in an hour or two. Right? It's ridiculously productive for project management, for structures, for team management, all that stuff. It's incredibly powerful, right? And to allow you to create these environments. On the other hand, I don't use GenAI in my development, but I use GenAI on the side in development workflows. It's a very big difference, right? Again, this is my opinion. Don't fine-tune on trained models, right? Get them off the shelves, right? The problem is if you hire AI experts today, most of them, this is exactly what they want to do, right? Because that's what they grew. So again, be careful, right? When you go on your journey to productize your services, be careful if the first thing that the team that you want to hire is to build a freaking model, right? Because that's what they grew at, that's what they know how to do. So again, be careful with that. And also leverage LLMs to convert your data into semantic knowledge graphs. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about, right? And the point of this is your data is so amazing, right? Your data is so valuable. At the moment, most of your data is static. It's not connected. You can't make assumptions. You can't make understandings. And even when you throw it to LLMs, it's still a black magic because you can't understand how you come out of it. So that's what I want to talk about, how to do that, right? So, basically, fundamentally, is use GenAI to graph and map. And you'll see where I use GenAI specifically, right? So I don't take all my data, pump it to an LLM going, hey, give me some answers, right? That's not what I'm doing, right? So I'm going to show an example of one of the things I'm building. So very quickly, the cyber boardroom is about creating, helping boards and execs understand cybersecurity. It's a bit that translation, right? How do you translate the cybersecurity stuff, which is very important, to something that boards and execs can understand? More importantly, how do you do that for multiple personas, right? So you create personalized messages to the persona, to the language, to the culture, to their state, to their role, etc. When I was doing that, I realized that I needed a reliable source of data because or else I had the catch-22, right? You need good data to get value from the platform. So I kind of went on this sort of, pivoting, a little bit of a tangent, and I decided to take news. So I decided to build a personalized news publishing business, right? So the idea here is to, and I'm going to show you exactly how that works, right? So the idea is that I want to take a persona, which is this text here, and I want to create personalized, right? So take a bunch of cybersecurity articles, and I want to create a personalized news feed for that persona, right? Now, this can be anything. This can be Rachel. This can be your Grafter documents. This can be a senior exec. This can be a person. This could be a project manager. This could be something. This is like a description of an audience. This is the source materials. That's the personalized to that audience materials, right? That's what I want to do. So you can apply this to everything. I do it for news because it's great because there's always new news coming along, so it's kind of like a nice source of stuff, right? So what happens is that this is the digest. So this is what you come out in the end. So what you got here is you got a title, you got an image, you got the summary, you got main areas, and you got strategic implications, the article analysis, and links, which I'm going to say in a second, right? So that's what I create. So I create one of these per person, and eventually I do one of these for the individual, for their culture, for their, again, in their language and what they care about. So let's look at this, right? Okay, so this is kind of the materials behind the scenes. What's important here is that, for example, this is the prompt, i.e. this is the text that you actually send to an LLM to get the results. The point here is there's no black magic. The point is that everything I do here, I can track it back. So this is what you send an LLM. That's how the LLMs can do stuff. You give it a prompt that says this is how you're going to behave. You tell it the schema you're using. This is the persona description. These are the articles information and the connections. And this is the data about the articles. You give this to an LLM, and then you can create stuff. In fact, you can take this prompt, and if you paste that exact prompt into ChatGPT, you get a custom version. You take that prompt into Claude, you get the person version. If you literally just go here and you change that text there, you get a different thing. And this is what I realized that the LLMs are very good at, is they're very good at translating. But the point here is I give it all the data. So the amount of hallucination you get here is very low because I'm not asking the LLM to tell me what's about the news or what it thinks, etc. I'm giving the exact materials for it to work on. And that's very different, right? And that's how I can create this, right? So the LLM responses. So what's important here from a technical point of view is that I don't work on text because the problem with text is that you don't have structure. So what you have here is you have a Python structure. This is the data that I get, and I have a direct mapping between the data that I get and this Python structure. What it means that if I want to have a particular set of information, I modify this and then I get the data from the LLM, right? But again, this is the kind of stuff that you need to be building because this removes black magic, right? This allows me to tell the LLM that my persona is a string. I have a description that goes there. I have an executive summary. I want an introduction, and I have several sections to go this. So this is how you tell the LLM, give me the data that you want. So this is how you take raw text, and you basically go to the LLM, hey, here's my raw text, let's say the Grafter materials. Here's a schema that I would like that to be converted to. Now the LLM, can you connect this to that? Right? The problem is in the past, this was all money to be spent on engineering. Processes would be very expensive to do, and more importantly, it was very brittle because every little change in structure. Here, I'm able to control this because I control the schema, and the schema is kind of, at least for that domain, is kind of very generic, right? And then you can get into ontologies and et cetera. But the point here is that when I get the LLM response, you can see that my introduction, I put it here. I put my title, my article, the information, for example, the link, the summary. So you can see that this is what I got from the LLM, and that builds me this. But I have a direct connection between this, the data that I got, the prompt that I received from the LLM, and that makes a big difference, right? So where it gets interesting is that how do I connect them? Right? Because I didn't want black magic on this. So the way I connect them is how do I go from a title from a CISO to a news article? So how do I go from here to there? Fundamentally, for example, here's a fintech company. How do I say, hey, how's a fintech CISO? How do you do this, right? Because again, you don't want black magic on this, right? The way we do it is we actually use an LLM to extract the entities. So I give it a prompt and say, hey, LLM, act like an extraction entity. And again, this is the prompt. Here's my relationship. I even give it a schema. So this is a schema that allows me to say, I'm going to get entities, I'm going to get relationships. And what it means, I go from here to the entities to that, right? So this graph here is a graph that represents that text, right? So this is an entity relationships where I can see the CEO, deals with emerging threats, digital transformation initiatives, manages that, deals responsible for reputational risk, works with legal counsel, etc. Right? So that's the graph. And for example, let's look at a couple of links, right? So if I look at, for example, that part here, which is that section there, I can see that mid-sized company is there, SOX is there, right? Regulatory compliance is there. So that's how I got there, right? So when I'm going to connect an article that deals with SOX or as I say, regulatory compliance to that CEO, I do it because it's on this text. If I change this text, my graph changes. Right? So you go from here to that graph, and then let's look at the other side. So again, CTO is the same thing. So that's variation. See, cloud migration, ALMLs, microservices, right? So depending on what that text is, you're going to get a different graph, right? The coolest thing of this is that you can then change the graph. You can say, ooh, that didn't get it right, it didn't get it wrong, but you don't edit here. You could also edit the graph directly. And that's very powerful. And now I'm bringing provenance to the whole workflow, right? Your text goes from being flat text to being this graph structure that you can then think about and prune it and think about how you want that to operate, right? So how I do that for the article. So the article is the same thing. You do the prompt, get the schema, connect the schema, and then out of the schema, I'm going to connect this with an article. Right? So this is the diagram or the graph of this particular article, right? Where you could see the same thing. Middleware connects there, critical's there, vulnerability connects there. And then, for in this case, I actually use the title and description, those two. So that's the graph I end up using, right? So this graph represents that news item, right? Same thing, if I look a couple more, that's, again, you can see the authorization tech connects there. A CVE, for example, that's a very important element. I can connect here, right? And again, middleware request. So this is how you start to connect this. And remember, this is cybersecurity, but this could be anything, right? At that level, right? And again, that's for this article, that's for the article. And by the way, the slides will be online, right? So you guys can see it there, right? But what's cool about this, you can even just by looking here, you get a sense of what it is, right? And that's the power. The power is that I can make sure that I can prune that and I can improve that. And then the final bit is how do you connect both, right? So how do I connect the persona graph with that graph there, right? And how do they relate to each other? So again, asking the question, what can you only do with an LLM? You go, all right, let's actually, very quickly, I convert that to a tree view, right? Which is easier to give the LLM. So for example, that article becomes that tree. So you can see that's the edges, that's the nodes. So I give this the LLM, not that, because the LLM, I didn't want the LLM to process an image, right? So what happens is when I give the tree view to a nested schema, right? So what I get in the end is I get now, basically, that's the persona graph, That's the article graph. So my third LM request is to give me the connections between both. So what you have here is showing me how do I connect that with that? How do I connect that with that? So how do I connect the persona graph to the article graph? And again, there's a direct path, right? So so that's the connection between the persona overview and the article I'm going to show, right? And using the LLMs for this allows me to scale, right? This process. In fact, ideally, I will probably not even need to use an LLM once the ontology and the taxonomy gets better. So that's another principle. You also want to make sure that you improve the process as it goes along. But you can see that with this, I don't have black magic, because I can tell you exactly why I'm showing this article to that particular persona, right? So in a way, is how do I connect this graph with that graph? And in this case, you see regulatory compliance is here, who maps to that, who then maps, for example, to another example there. Yep.
Can I just say you talk about black magic? Is that basically where you're not prescribing all of these little steps, and you can then, like as an engineer, rework them? You're saying, okay, here's my input, create me the output, and I have no idea what's in
exactly.
it, and I can't, there's no audit trail, there's no way to change it, you're just entirely outsourcing that to AI. So
exactly.
Just do this job for me. And you're saying, I'm going to structure it, I'm going to be very precise about how it's going to work, and you're going to do these little bits and steps, and we then have a control and an audit trail.
Absolutely. Exactly. And the first thing I did when I started this process was exactly that. I was like, hey, all I need to do is take my news sources, give it to ChatGPT, and give it the persona, and then give me some personalized news. And it worked, right? But as soon as I tried to make any changes, to try to understand or try to debug it, in fact, this is a really cool example, right? This is why we get provenance explainability. You know why? Because this is actually not a good article to show CEO, right? So if you really look at this, you're going, hold on, this is the persona. That's really not a good article. And what you could see here is actually the score was low, and actually there was some sort of jumps from regulatory compliance to critical vulnerability. The cool thing is I can debug these now, right? I can now go, well, that's what's wrong, so I can figure out the best workflows, right? Because, for example, if you look here, that's a much better graph. High score, regulatory compliance. So this is a good example where everything goes wrong. Like regulatory compliance, regulatory bodies, you might go, well, that makes sense. But to try to create a system that takes that into account becomes super difficult. Same thing here, business continuity, business continuity planning. They're pretty obvious when you look at it, but to try to code around it, and even things like capital cases and little things, that becomes really hard to programmatically do.
We were talking about the impact LLMs can have on a development team and how fast you can go. And Phil made the point that it's almost like putting that in the hands of a junior developer. And if you don't put the right prompts in, you could end up in a lot of trouble. Can you bring in a little bit of perspective from my point of view? Is this almost like having a medium or senior developer writing those prompts, taking away the hallucinations, etc. The more detail you put them in, the less black magic there is within.
So I would say that this is adding an architecture to that workflow. It's adding good engineering to that workflow. So in here, you still have prompts, but the prompts are now limited. So I can create a path. So in a way, that's the job of the senior and experienced architect and developer, is to create those paths, right? And then you want to empower the people. In fact, you want to empower the users to play around with it. So in this case, I'm empowering the users to play around and to change the prompts or the text of the personas, right? Because they want to trick it. But the flow and the architecture, that starts to get locked down. But again, it can be changed, but at least I have ability to, when someone says, why am I, in this case, why am I seeing this piece of news, or why am I getting this article on a legal stuff, I say, why do I'm getting that article versus that article, etc., I can debug it, right? And remember that the real world has a really nice way to validate everything, right? Because if you're the main expert, you will look at something going, this is wrong, right? Or this is right, or this is working, or this doesn't work, right? The point here is that with this provenance and using semantic knowledge graphs, by the way, it's very well thought through. There's a lot of great concepts around it, right? And there's ontology and taxonomy, which I haven't even got into. But all of that stuff, right? GenAI allows us to create that at scale, where in the past we couldn't. And that's the difference. So imagine if all your content was in structure like this. Right? So when you guys talk about creating customized versions for your companies, with this kind of stuff, you can create these highly personalized briefings for every stage of the company. And you can even simulate it, right? You know, at all those levels, right? My point is that you want provenance, you want explainability, right? And this is the way to do it, right? And that's the key, right? So that's how you do it. So for example, this is a good example. Like, so this is a cool example of CI pipelines, GitHub Actions, right? Again, this kind of mappings is very hard to automate. right? But the LLMs do this very well. In fact, you could even have another LLM just to double check this stuff. And by then you get really good assurances. But I don't have a lot of black magic, right? That's the key here. So that's a much better article to show a CEO than the previous ones. The cool thing is I can now deal with it, right? And that's the flow, right? So very quickly, this is just a couple of minutes, right? So the part of this, I'm also working in a cyber boardroom. The idea is that cybersecurity is at board level. You know, as you kind of see, again, in the UK, this starts to be a lot more relevant, right? There's not a lot of cybersecurity experience. The challenge here is that you need to personalize the content, right? So what I kind of did, and that was my problem as a CISO. My problem was not to have relationships and to get stuff done. My problem, how to scale it. Right? If I have the board members and the execs and the operation and my team here, I need to take one single message and translate it for every single one of them. That never scaled, right? So basically, again, we need better decisions. So we need to take the board members that need to learn, understand, engage, cybersecurity, and you need the CISOs and the tech people who are really bad at explaining what the hell they do, right? Fair enough, right? Because we're very domain experts, right? So how do you bridge that gap, right? So I'm using the LLMs, again, to translate content. And I'm using the semantic knowledge graphs to make sure you connect that, right? So you have this platform, which fundamentally is the cyber boardroom, whole bunch of stuff here. By the way, everything I showed here is open source, right? So again, I don't play the moat of my moat and my IP is not the technology, right? Is the system, is the customers, is the users, is knowing how to get that stuff done, right? That's the play I'm making, right? And then, you know, there's a pitch here. I'm looking for investment if you want to do this, but I want to find the right investors. And there's a business plan that it's all online. All the investor pack is all online. And even there's a bot that you can talk to and ask the questions, you know, as an investor, right? And yeah, you can give it a spin. There's a cyber boardroom. There's all the feeds that are coming there, and that's it.
Question. Sorry. The output is as good as data.
Sorry?
The output that you give,
Mm-hmm.
the article that you create,
Yeah.
is as good as the data that you give in there. So my pitch or my company's pitch, or what I want to target to the CISO,
Yeah.
you have to translate that into
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying as a
Yeah.
business,
Yeah.
back into what you want to, you know, tell the CISO.
Yep.
Or the CTO.
No, the senior exec, yeah.
And those prompts that you say, you have to understand.
Mm-hmm.
What is the handshake? How good is the handshake
Mm-hmm.
between what I want to say,
Yeah.
what my SDRs want to say,
Yeah.
versus what you are going to put in there? Because
Yeah.
that could be completely different
Yeah.
if I don't give you the right information.
Oh, no, absolutely, right? But the problem today is not doing that, right? The problem is doing that at scale. The problem is at the moment you take your message and you have a generic message for a generic board member, for a generic executive, for a generic target. The idea here is that you translate it to that person. You translate it to that culture, to that language, to that state. But the other point here is that even those messages are all human-owned, right? So everything I do here, everything is with human in the loop, right? The difference is the scalability. Right? The difference is that if you want to create these messages and output this to your execs or to you communicating to, the reason why you only have one message or two or five is because you can't scale the creation of those messages. But if you can create them very personalized, means that you brief them. Like, for example, like, you know, I used to do this again manually. Like, so if this was my board, right? Let's say I would have a one-pager for Rachel. I have one word for him. I had 10 pages for him. I have 15 pages from that person. I have nothing for that person, right? And I'll probably be briefing their direct reports so that by the time I arrive and say, hey, I want to do this in cybersecurity. This is why we're doing this. This is the status. They knew about it. The problem is a question of scale, right? It's how you translate those business messages, right? And in the past, I couldn't get that to scale. I couldn't, you know, if I asked to my team to give me the data, they'll be spending half their time doing that stuff, right? Creating the evidence. Where now, again, with this data, it's much more empowering, right? And what you can do now is if you have an engineering team, you can automate that process, right? But the point I'm making here is that if you, instead of using the LLMs as a black box, right, you think of where can I actually use it where they add a lot of value. So in my case, I'm using to create the semantic graphs, in fact, to see the semantic graphs, because after that, I don't need the LLM because the person himself can actually create it, or whoever's helping on that step, right?
The question is, one question leaves that is, do you see the ROI coming out of using LLMs?
Yeah.
And the messaging, because you're getting scale now.
Yeah, of course.
So the call to action is that customer's going to make a choice.
Yeah.
Talk to you. So are you seeing the ROI coming out of this?
Yeah.
You have those numbers as well.
Well,
how,
okay. So I'm at the stage where I'm still on the early users and customers, right? So, but the point here is that the business that I have here would not be possible without GenAI. That's the key, right? And the other final point is that I think it's super important that in the way I talk about the commodities, that whole platform, right, is serverless. So that means that whole platform costs just about nothing to run unless there's a customer interacting with it. But this is very important because it means that you build something and suddenly you don't have almost like this kill date in the end, or you have this massive amount of revenue that you need to generate it even just to break even. The point here is that the platform themselves, because it's serverless, is ridiculously cheap to run. It's the LLM costs to create the transformations that cost something, but you can pass that to the customer.
Can I just check? So if you use that sort of, now, by the way, you are far advanced of anything I would be able to do anytime soon myself looking at those sort of problems. But let's just say you have your dev team that can put those kind of trees in and make that kind of model. Can you then have a sort of a user experience in the front end that one of your sales reps, for example, can customize the persona, can then customize maybe a business problem that needs to be put, but can actually put that into a more usable...
Yeah, that's coming, of course.
And then it comes out.
So I'll give you an example. One of the businesses that I'm already involved in is a business to do that for risk analysis, right? So the idea is that you as a company can go there, you can fill a bunch of forms, you can, if I interactively, not even have a chat, just basically it's like imagine a tree, right? Imagine if that graph is the data that you have provided as you interact with the platform, right? What type of company you are, what kind of industry you're in, what kind of data you have, etc. So you build this graph that represents your business. So the idea there is, yes, the graph will exist behind the scenes. The point is that by the time you finish interacting with that business, you're going to get a highly detailed guidance. And also for a consultant, they can take that and really add value, right? So that's a good example of a side business that is built exactly on the top of this technology. Ironically, it's been funded by a company who is a cybersecurity provider that wants to then pick up once the customer has, like for example, you guys, I know how much of data security you have done an analysis. You'll be a great candidate for going in there, saying the type of data you have, and then going, right, this is kind of what we need to do, and then how do we do it, right? But those kind of things, and you're right, that's why I'm investing for, right? Because I think the UI and the experience is very important.
I need somebody with your skill set in order to develop that, and I have to say, I'm sitting there looking at that, and I'm thinking, very advanced. Know exactly what you're doing clearly, but nobody in my team does, so we kind of need somebody who can do what you do.
But well, fair enough, you need to hire that. But the other thing I would say is that the nice thing of this is that, although you're not technical, if I showed you a graph like that connects the input with the output and the reasons why, you'll be able to understand it, right? You'll be able to say, and more importantly, you'll be able to say why I wasn't shown this or why I was shown this. And then the idea is that as you tweak the graph, you get different results, right? So again, you don't need to understand that workflow to be an operator at the highest level,
no,
right?
Exactly, and I'm just thinking about the options if you get the sort of vanilla pack underneath, but somebody can input some data and then customises a report out on the other end on whatever your business outcomes might be. So,
yeah, I think your point is there's going to need to be some setup done from an expert perspective, but the reality is after that, you're going to be able to run some of their stuff in a different way, but also without the need for a ton of staff and tooling, which would have been the challenge before. Mindful that we are. I've got one final question for you.
All right.
Well, where do you get your coffee from? Because your energy is fucking tight.
So here's the thing, right? I'm not drinking coffee. I stopped drinking coffee many years ago.
Are you going to confess to taking drugs?
No. I run on green tea and a little bit of English breakfast tea.
Wow, okay, I'm impressed.